This lecture is called Heresies of the Open Border. Most of us, if we are lucky, live long enough to complain about growing old. As the years roll by, the world we live in begins to seem an alien place, and the people we meet regard us as helpless idiots completely out of the picture. The old guys just don't get it. Nonetheless, as the years go by, some human beings may actually gain in wisdom what they lose in excitement, and in a country that does not value learning or study, where the word research means looking up factitious articles on Wikipedia, old age may constitute the best education anyone can have. I'd like to share with you some of the fruits of my own experience. I've been thinking and writing about immigration for 35 years. Growing up, I took it for granted that all sensible people, including even Stalinist communists, wanted to defend the borders of their own country. They realized that if every nation, if it was actually a nation, had the right and duty to decide what sort of people they would be letting in. By the late 1970s, however, it began to be clear that the Democratic Party in general and that party leaders like Ted Kennedy were trying to increase their party's power by changing our immigration policy. The Hart-Celler Immigration Act of 1975 radically altered the old formula, which was based on the immigration patterns of earlier generations, and to privilege third-world immigrants who would provide cheap labor for big business, and more important, to the Kennedys and their worshippers, votes for the Democratic Party. This soon became a bipartisan policy that was characterized by novelist Edward Abbey in a simple sentence: conservatives got their cheap labor, liberals got their cheap cause. Those of us who had begun to think about the consequences of this policy imagined that the election of Ronald Reagan would make a difference. It did. In the Republican Bush years, the Republican Party took a sharp turn to the left on the issues that John O'Sullivan, the last decent editor of National Review, used to describe as the national question: immigration, trade, globalization. Free trade and open borders became the mantra of the Wall Street Journal, and U.S. foreign policy experts in both parties began to implement Jimmy Carter's call to promote global democracy, which meant committing American troops and risking their lives in order to draw third-world countries into the American consumerist orbit. This nonsense culminated in Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's demand that America promote revolution and even to go to war to make sure Muslim women in the Middle East could dress the way they wanted to. Well, there's a cause worth dying for. Interestingly, Ms. Clinton was perfectly happy to flood the country with wife-abusing Muslim men. What conclusion can we draw except that the American political elite is willing to waste money and blood improving the lives of people everywhere in the world except here in the United States? I first started thinking seriously about immigration sometime back in the last ice age, before man-made global warming had turned Michigan and Illinois into a second Florida. Early in the first Reagan term, I went to Washington to talk with my old friend and ally, Samuel T. Francis. Sam and I had met at the University of North Carolina, where we were both graduate students. And in D.C., we both had dinner with a senior aide to a North Carolina senator, and the aide insisted on spending the entire evening talking about immigration. When I briefly changed the subject, the aide got up to leave, explaining that immigration was the most crucial issue facing Americans. I protested. Surely, even if you're right, there are other issues facing our country that we can talk about. He answered, "Of course there are, but if we don't quickly do something about immigration, we won't have a country." A year or two after this conversation, I became editor of Chronicles magazine. I almost immediately began bringing up the question of immigration. Wealthy donors complained that the GOP leadership knew what it was doing. Not only did immigrants keep the price of labor low, which was the main point for them, but they would serve as a counterweight to the solid block of Democratic voters provided by African Americans. I thought they were delusional, and time has proved me right. But to this day, few of these old Republicans have opened their eyes. Back in the 1980s and 90s, influential Republicans listened to the siren songs of their party's left-wing leaders: Bill Bennett, Jack Kemp, Newt Gingrich, and the Bushes. The leaders of the so-called conservative movement got so fed up with my treatment of immigration that they banded together to try to get me fired when I published a special issue entitled A Nation of Immigrants. I found myself denounced to the pages of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Commentary. Even National Review, a magazine for which I had been writing regularly, joined in the attack. What was interesting about the response of Bill Buckley and some, not all, of his colleagues was the simple fact that Mr. Buckley had himself frequently warned against the dangers of open immigration. And what was more odd, he had never really changed his mind. He had simply got frightened. This was a very confusing period to live through, as the conservative movement abandoned its commitment to protecting the nation and preserving our traditions. Many conservative writers were finding it difficult to understand why almost the entire conservative movement endorsed Ted Kennedy's immigration policy. I understood the motivation of the Washington think tanks. The Heritage Foundation was getting huge amounts of money from Japanese and Taiwanese businessmen. But why did NR denounce people like Sam Francis, Joe Sobran, Pat Buchanan, Peter Brimelow, and myself? The fog of my confusion began to lift when I was invited to speak at a major conference on immigration. The conference included conservative policy wonks as well as pragmatic liberals like Governor Dick Lamb of Colorado, Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin. Also my friend Peter Brimelow, who eventually turned from a lucrative career at Forbes to devoting himself to this one issue of immigration. I gave a talk on the cultural conflict caused by massive Latin American immigration. I made it clear that I admired many aspects of the cultures of Latin America, and as the chairman of a literary prize committee, I had been partly responsible for awarding prizes to Octavio Paz, Mario Vargas Llosa, and Jorge Borges. I spent my life learning foreign languages and studying foreign cultures, and this study has taught me one highly important lesson: that great cultural traditions, like those of ancient Greece, Renaissance Italy, Elizabethan England, and the early American Republic, are an outgrowth of the people and their traditions. It is not the Constitution that made our country great. It was the people who made the Constitution. Of course, vigorous nations can and should take in a certain number of newcomers, but if once they allow themselves to be overrun, as the Roman Empire was overrun by German barbarians, their culture will be corrupted and destroyed. That was my argument then. It's my argument now. The response to my talk was shock and horror, not so much from pragmatic liberal Democrats like Governor Dick Lamb, but from the conservative Republicans who made their living as experts on immigration. In fact, liberals like Dick Lamb and Senator Gaylord Nelson were willing to talk freely and even boldly on these questions. But I was informed, not by leftists, but by opponents of unrestricted immigration, people I had mistakenly thought were my allies, that anyone who raised the cultural question was more or less a bigot. How convenient. Anyone who goes to the root of the immigration question is a bigot, just as anyone who points out the shaky moral and legal foundations of affirmative action is a racist, and anyone who argues for moral order is a fascist. Anyone who supports the free market is either an anarchist or a cold-hearted capitalist insensitive to human suffering. The future of American culture and the American nation is the heart of the immigration question. And if the cultural question remains taboo, the doom of America is fixed, even if the means and the will were found to seal the border and repatriate large numbers of illegal Mexican immigrants. There is no quick fix like a wall or restrictive policies that will save a people whose leaders are committed to national suicide. To oppose mass immigration on strictly economic grounds is a strategy that ensures political and social defeat. Economics is a blind science that cannot tell the difference between citizens and foreigners, friends and enemies. We're told, for example, that the soundest criteria for the legal immigrants we should admit is their educational level and potential earnings. That may be, but if 400 million hard-working and intelligent Chinese immigrants were admitted, our economy might boom for a while, but our grandchildren would be Chinese and not American. Chicano activists understand this reality, which is why they talk about Reconquista and their dream of rebuilding the Aztec world of Aztlan. Professional critics of immigration policy who pretend this question does not exist are like the cowards who hear burglars invading the home and then pull the covers up over their head. Economic pragmatists think they are playing practical politics by setting aside all questions of basic principle. Unfortunately, they are leaving the moral high ground to leftist idealists who take their stand on lofty principles like international human rights and the brotherhood of man. This has two very serious consequences. First, it means that young people and idealists are repelled by conservative arguments that rest on greed and indifference to human decency. Marxists like the Obamas and Clintons tell Americans it is their duty to help the world, while pragmatic Republicans say that's all very nice and they would open the border, but we just cannot afford it. This is very similar to the argument over the death penalty. Opponents say it is humane, while defenders say it costs too much to keep murderers alive in prison. One side argues for dollars and cents, the other for morality, and that is why the death penalty is outlawed in 19 states and a dead letter outside the South. This is one of several reasons why students are willing to listen to their silly professors and are so regularly attracted to the left. They stay on the left until they have to earn a living and pay taxes, but even then, when they have a family and some experience of the real world, they retain a warm and fuzzy feeling for the leftist principles they absorbed in school. They may vote Republican, but it is for Republicans like Marco Rubio, Susan Collins, and Jeff Flake. So the second consequence is that many people who think they are quite conservative are simply confused. They're nothing of the kind. Their instincts may be right, but they cannot defend their positions because they do not know where or how to make a stand. This dilemma is not just over immigration, but over nearly every left-right division in American politics. Conservatives inevitably try to defend their positions with left-wing language and principles. The welfare state is bad not because it's inherently evil for third parties to steal a working man's money and buy votes from the unemployed. No, it's simply too costly and inefficient, and worst of all, the welfare state makes slaves of the welfare recipients. It's all true, but it's not the fundamental reason to oppose welfare. We are not permitted to sympathize with working taxpayers, only with social predators. Opponents of abortion almost never talk about the disgusting behavior of any mother who would consider taking the life of her child. No, they talk about some general right to life that immediately opens up the seamless garment argument that if abortion is wrong, so are capital punishment and wars, even a just war waged in defense. Leftists are entirely right to take their stand on principle. The only trouble is that their principles are almost always entirely false. False politically, false morally, and false to the Christian religion. Sticking to immigration for a moment, the basic argument for open borders is a Marxist one, though Marx himself borrowed much of it from 18th century idealistic pacifists. In a nutshell, Marx argued that states and nations were created long, long ago at the dawn of history in a coup d'etat staged by the same evil men who created capitalism and the family. Nation-states are inherently evil and illegitimate, and their only function in the modern world is to serve as laboratories for communist experiments in changing human nature. Once all major nations become communist, we'll have no borders, no government. But until that happens, rich nations have the duty to transfer their wealth and opportunities to poor nations. In Marx's day, travel was so difficult. Immigration to Europe and North America from Africa, Asia, and South America was inconceivable. But applied to the 20th century, Marx's analysis is the basis for open borders, free trade, political and economic globalization. At this point, a Christian socialist will want to butt in and argue that nation-states, national borders, and immigration restrictions are all contrary to Christian teaching. I used to think they were simply ignorant. But an ignorance so complete, so perfect, cannot be entirely a natural product. They have to work hard to remain that stupid. Ignorance, says one of Oscar Wilde's characters, is a rare exotic fruit. Touch it and the bloom is gone. So I've decided to treat these Marxists as morally responsible human beings and simply say they lie, whether they know it or not. They lie about everything from global warming to Head Start programs to the judicial nominees of any Republican president, even about the liberal Brett Kavanaugh, who is more often than not on their side. Viewing Christianity as the enemy, intellectuals have always felt justified in misrepresenting its teachings, either to make them contemptible, as Nietzsche and the neo-pagans have done, or to pervert them to what they saw as a good use. So-called Christian socialists and social gospelers made it appear that true Christianity, as opposed to the bogus faith that informed Christians for 2 millennia, true Christianity would dispense with all distinctions, including national boundaries. To delegitimate the right of nations to defend their territory, leftists like to quote Paul's statement in Galatians, that in baptism there is neither Jew nor Greek, as if Paul's intent was not to repress the quarrels that broke out between Gentile and Jewish Christians, but rather to obliterate ethnic and cultural boundaries. The absurdity and dishonesty of such an interpretation is made clear by what Paul goes on to say. There is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus. Now surely no candid reader would argue that Paul, who more than once instructs slaves to obey their masters and runaway slaves to return, nobody would accuse Paul of condemning slavery per se. And Paul, who has been unfairly stigmatized as a misogynist, can hardly be accused of pursuing an early feminist agenda. Some leftists have pretended that Christians cannot restrict immigration into their country, even if they believe it is harmful to their nation's security and prosperity. They cite such statements as, "Thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt." But they conveniently ignore the dozens of passages in which aliens are condemned and despised throughout the pages of the Old Testament. A Jew could charge interest on money loaned to a stranger, but not to a fellow Jew. Second Esdras, among the countless curses it pronounces against Babylon and Egypt, includes the threat that those who labor will labor in vain, because strangers shall reap their fruits and spoil their goods, overthrow their houses, and take their children captive. Like most ancient peoples, the Israelites were intensely chauvinistic and xenophobic. By their own exaggerated account in Joshua and Judges, they exterminated the Gentile population of Canaan when they entered the Promised Land, and they were forever quarreling with their neighbors, and more perilously with the great kingdoms of the Middle East. The passage of time and the experience of exile did nothing to soften Jewish chauvinism. In what might be understood as an outburst of xenophobia, Nehemiah tells us that the Israelites returning from the Babylonian captivity separated themselves from non-Jews and made a covenant not to intermarry with them. Nehemiah was clearly indulging in a bit of wishful thinking here. In light of these and many other passages I might have cited, it is simply disingenuous to argue that the ancient Jews' undoubted kindness to sojourning strangers constitutes an argument against either defensive war or restrictions on immigration or special laws regarding immigrants. The apparent contradiction in the Old Testament's approach to foreigners is easily resolved when we take a closer look at the words. The Hebrew language and the law made a clear distinction between, on the one hand, sojourning immigrants who have been given permission to stay in the land and generously accorded the protection of the law. This is rendered in Greek as a proselytos, and in Latin as advena. And on the other hand, the foreigners who have not been given this legal status. In Greek, this is allogenes, and in Latin by alienigena. While sojourners are treated as potential or real converts to Judaism, as the Greek word proselyte now in English suggests, other foreigners are unclean. An alien could not so much as touch the bread being offered to God, And if a priest's daughter married a foreigner, she could not eat the holy food that priests and their families partook of. This is in Leviticus 22. A foreigner who approached the tabernacle was put to death, and no bread could be offered to their God from a foreigner's hand, because there is corruption in them. The restrictions on unlegalized foreigners were not limited to religious practices. A Jew could charge interest on money loaned to a stranger, but not to a Jew. And the Jews' ethnic first cousins, the Edomites, only gained full rights after 3 generations of living cheek by jowl with the children of Israel. The wise Solomon took a census of the strangers in Israel and sent them off to do hard labor. The writings of the New Testament, while they repeat the earlier admonitions to treat proselytes decently, have virtually nothing to say on the subject of either territorial sovereignty or immigration. The writers in the New Testament assume the backdrop of the Roman Empire, whose rulers and armies are authorized to defend the Greco-Roman world. When massive and unauthorized immigration did take place from the 4th to the 6th centuries A.D., the Goths, Vandals, and Lombards destroyed the empire and put civilization on hold for several centuries. Historically, Christian rulers and their subjects have had no reluctance to defend their commonwealths against pagans and heretics, and if they had no other piece of scripture, the story of the Tower of Babel would have informed them that their Creator had established separate peoples and warned them against any attempt to corral all the nations of the world into one world government. I think anyone listening to me will recall the story in Genesis, how mankind started getting uppity and built a great city with a tower that would reach up to the heavens. Their Creator looked at this and realized that the men of this great city were making a universal empire to challenge God Himself, and He caused them to speak in different languages to separate them. Put simply, globalism was then and is now the political ideology of those who wish to be as gods. In Babylon, the project failed because of the multiplicity of languages and cultures on the job site. In America, everyone is told every day that cultural diversity is a blessing, though they never explain just how or why it's a blessing. Anyone who has ever spent a lot of time in a culturally diverse country or region is aware of the many problems. In my case, I spent a great deal of time in the former Yugoslavia during the period of the breakup. It wasn't a pretty spectacle. Bosnian Muslims were spit-roasting their Christian enemies, as they had done previously during World War II, and Albanian Muslims were murdering Christians, dynamiting churches, and digging up graveyards. These were people who had lived together for 500 years or more. And let's not forget that the U.S. government encouraged, paid, and armed these Muslim terrorists. In Iraq, the Kurds were murdering and are murdering now and expelling Arabs, Christians far more than Muslims. And there is hardly a country in sub-Saharan Africa where ethnic conflicts do not result in mass murders. You could learn the same lesson in Los Angeles or Chicago, where criminal gangs are organized mainly along ethnic lines. In Los Angeles, black prison inmates have begged to be segregated into separate prisons from the Mexican criminals who have been murdering them. In an important study of political violence around the world, Professor Donald Horowitz of Duke concluded that ethnic conflict was almost always the major underlying cause. Where the overt cause was religion, as in Ireland or in India, religion was merely a marker for ethnic differences, as it is between Bosnian Muslims and Bosnian Serbian Orthodox. They're largely the same people culturally and linguistically, but they have become separate peoples by identifying with different religions. One of the greatest ethnic genocides of the last century took place when the Turkish government gave its blessing to the Kurds, who cherished dreams of slaughtering the Armenians. These same Kurds, now ethnically cleansing northern Iraq, are the darlings of both political parties in America, not just Hillary Clinton, but Ted Cruz, Carly Fiorina, John McCain, and during periods of electioneering, candidates in both parties will always call for their solution, which is to arm the Kurds, which is about the most foolish and evil thing I can imagine the American government continuing to do. Tension, conflict, and mass murder are only the most obviously bitter fruits of cultural diversity. If I had not decided to stick to the high road in this talk, I would bring up some of the peculiar traditions in third world countries that are being imported into the United States, and many of them involve women and marriage. Polygamy, for example, which is legal in most Muslim countries, as is the keeping of concubines within the home. Wife beating and wife murder. Female genital mutilation. Other quaint customs involve standards of cleanliness and sanitation. We have strange Western customs such as washing our hands after using the bathroom, especially if we are working with food. Using designated plumbing facilities rather than eliminating our waste into farm fields where berries and vegetables are being grown for human consumption. I strongly urge you to check out the labels on your spinach and strawberries, and when in doubt, wash them thoroughly. One of the most significant contributions being made by cultural diversity is the introduction of exotic diseases, not just E. coli and salmonella, but killer strains of pneumonia brought in by Russian criminals, tuberculosis, and even black plague across our southern border. And if I wanted to drag you down into the gutter, I might talk about the ultraviolet drug cartels that are terrorizing the American Southwest. The homicidal maniacs in gangs like the Salvadoran MS-13. The number 13 identifies them as part of an affiliation of Southerners, as they're called, Sureños. SUR-13 are groups of loosely affiliated gangs that pay tribute to the Mexican mafia. Many Sureño gangs are at war with each other, especially in Latin America, but they set aside their hostilities when they enter the prison system in the United States and make common cause against American convicts, black and white. When they are not in prison, MS-13 members engage in drug dealing, child prostitution, sex slavery, rape, and murder of anyone they think they have a problem with. A year or so ago, several of them beat to death someone they mistakenly believed belonged to a different rival group. Most MS-13 members are young, but a 47-year-old Salvadoran illegal who has been deported multiple times was arrested for beating people to death with a baseball bat. In a deliberately deceptive article, the Washington Post reports, Ramon Escobar was arrested in Houston several times, dating from the mid-1990s. Authorities said he spent 5 years in prison for burglary and has also been charged with assault and criminal trespass in separate cases. After his most recent removal, Escobar illegally re-entered the country and filed an appeal of his immigration case, according to ICE. This was in June of 2016. The court granted the appeal and ICE released Escobar from custody. Well, why do we bother? Why do we fund ICE? It's like the time I once spotted a burglar that the police had given me a robocall warning our neighborhood about. I called 911 and they promised someone would get in touch with me. They never called. They never came. I'm not even going to talk about such people as El Chapo or Pablo Escobar. They are only the most glaring examples of what cultural diversity turns out to mean. Because even where two cultures are somewhat compatible, they do not tend to share their virtues and higher cultural accomplishments. Consider one little example that's familiar to all of us. I spend a great deal of time in Italy every year, and occasionally I'm dragged here in America to what is called an Italian restaurant. Neapolitan pizza and risotto Milanese are wonderful foods, the treasures. But in America, they turn into slop. The same thing is true of Mexican food. Truly wonderful cuisine in Mexico. But even a few feet across the border into El Paso or Del Rio, it becomes garbage. The same can be said of Greek and Chinese cuisine. What is true of the cuisines is true of culture generally. We need to be someone in particular with a specific language, specific religion, and cultural tradition before we can venture out to appreciate other traditions. The poet Robert Frost put it beautifully. My friends all know I'm interpersonal, but long before I'm interpersonal, away down inside, I'm personal. Just so, before we're international, we're national, and act as nationals. The colors are kept unmixed on the palette, or better, on dishes around the room. I often reflect on a conversation I had with my friend, the British novelist Muriel Spark, when I visited her in Tuscany. Until her death, she was one of the 2 or 3 best fiction writers in English, such books as The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, Memento Mori, and A Far Cry from Kensington. During the wars in Yugoslavia, she told me, she often thought back on the days when the British thought of Yugo, as they call it, as an inexpensive place for a holiday. But imagine, she said, all that time they were lying in the sun or eating cevapcici and drinking cheap wine. They were being waited upon by smiling waiters and desk clerks who were plotting genocide against each other. I've been told by both Serbs and Croats that this is not really the way it was, but it is an uneasy thought. When we sit in ethnic restaurants, for example, and listen to the cheerful music, what is that music really telling us? I like Mexican pop music a lot, which seems to me to be superior to our own music. But there's an entire genre of music devoted to celebrating the exploits of narco-terrorists. One of my favorite songs is a little ditty, El Gringo y el Mexicano, sung by the great norteño group Los Tigres del Norte, who come from Sinaloa. They're among the best-selling Mexican musicians on either side of the border, and their specialty is the narco corrida, the ballads that sing of the violent lives and deaths of drug lords and immigrant smugglers. In the song, Cipriano and his wife, Rosa Maria, crossed the border as espaldas mojadas. Please excuse my terrible Spanish. And they find work on a ranch near McAllen, Texas. The gringo boss takes a fancy to Rosa Maria and intimidates her into becoming his mistress. When Cipriano finds out, he kills the gringo first, and then, despite her plea that the gringo had threatened to turn them into immigration authorities, he kills his own wife. After 20 years in prison, Cipriano crosses back into Mexico, where he is embraced by his son, who tells him, "Dad, you did the right thing." He says he too would kill a woman who had betrayed him. He's talking about his own mother. The song takes several things for granted. First, if you need a job, just go to the other side of the river. The border is arbitrary and meaningless. The members of Los Tigres, by the way, now live in San Jose, California. Second, the gringos who employ Mexicans almost always exploit them and abuse them. Third, killing gringo exploiters and the women they exploit is not only justifiable but praiseworthy and necessary. The popularity of these songs, which are played all the time on the radio and even taught in California's public schools, should give us pause. Now, by the way, I'm not saying that they don't have an ethic or a morality. In some senses, this strong revenge ethic is superior to the "I'll just roll over and play dead and allow people to abuse me" morality taught by American liberals, but it is different. No one knows how many Mexicans and Mexican Americans reside in the United States. In the roundest of numbers, there are perhaps 15 million Mexican immigrants, a third of them at least illegal, and perhaps 15 million U.S. citizens of Mexican origin of descent, making a total of some 30 millions. There are at least 10 million more people from other parts of Latin America. As a percentage of the American population, Mexicans and Mexican Americans and Latino Americans have overtaken African Americans as the dominant minority group. And if current rates of immigration are permitted to continue, the Mexican and Latino proportion of the population figure would double in perhaps 10 years. Given the differential in birth rates between non-Mexican and Mexican Americans, the United States may be rapidly headed toward a situation resembling that of Canada, which is bilingual, bicultural, and binational. Except there, the tension is between two European groups, British and French, and they've been influencing each other for 1,000 years. In the worst case, a binational America would be the scene of an armed struggle between the two groups. More optimistically, one might imagine a future United States in which Americans of Mexican descent have been peacefully assimilated. Which scenario will play out, I simply do not know. But this is one thing I do know. The problem does not lie with the immigrants themselves, it lies with us, a nation that has lost its own sense of history and identity. Since at least the 1960s, we have accepted leftist anti-American and anti-Western propaganda and paid for the Marxist feminist teachers who shoved it down the throats of our school children. Our historical and cultural roots were torn up, and we were kept comparatively ignorant of our true history. We've been taught to view ourselves as the descendants of oppressors, exploiters, and murderers. The names Travis, Bowie, and Houston are forgotten in the United States, and David Crockett is remembered only for a silly Disney TV series. Even in Texas, there's a campaign to eliminate the word hero from textbook descriptions of the Alamo. We've been taught to hate our country, and we cannot stanch the hemorrhaging border for precisely the same reason that we insist on teaching our children to hate the people and habits that made this country. The first step toward resolving the cultural problems presented by mass immigration is to quit denying their existence. The second step is to recognize the fact that immigrants will affect us as much as we affect them. The third is to recognize that the larger part of the problem is of our own devising. American mass culture, including the schools that purvey mass education, are breeding grounds for anti-American and anti-Western resentment and for American self-hatred. To halt and reverse this process, Americans must be willing to take several boldly conservative steps. Quite apart from whatever is done to control legal and illegal immigration, we have to transform the teaching of humanities in elementary and high schools as much as in universities. Our schools today do not value Western culture as something good in itself or as our precious heritage, but only as the foundation for an open society that encourages toleration of opposing points of view. That is the best they can do. These are the proponents of Western civ, because many textbooks and teachers present history as a morality play in which evil European men bully women, burn Indian villages, and lynch African Americans. We need to revive the older understanding that the purposes of a nation's educational system is to form the character and historical imagination of the nation's citizens and inform their character from early childhood. In our case, this would mean that European and American history would have to be taught from a Western and American point of view. That beginning in the lower grades, the classics of English and American literature should be required reading, and that the ancient Greek and Latin classics, which along with the teaching of Latin were the foundation of our civilization for over 2,000 years, must be given once again their honored place in the curriculum. The celebration of American history and the revival of our civilization should not be made at the expense of the rich cultural heritage that Mexicans and other Latin Americans bring with them. Although many, if not most, recent immigrants have been poorly educated, there's no reason why they and their children cannot be encouraged to learn real Spanish instead of the patois that many of them come here speaking, sometimes as a second language, and to imbibe the literary and cultural traditions of Spain and Latin America. In fact, to become more Spanish, this would be a means of becoming more generally Western and more American. That's not our enemy. Study of their authentic history and culture would replace the narcissistic and inflammatory Chicano studies programs that indoctrinate Latinos into a culture of victimology that can only retard their social and economic progress. If American citizens prove themselves incapable of taking control of their future by controlling immigration and restoring the institutions of their civilization, they will not be so much losing their country as acknowledging that it is already lost. There is no fate or law of historical necessity that says America has to lose its identity. Our future is up to us, just as it always has been.